idea that, through the eyeglass, the cousins viewed each other with some penetration even before Amy came in. Then at last, when Amy did come in, it was not, any more than Susan, to go out again. It would take us too far to imagine what might have happened had Miss Thrush made it a condition of her benevolence that the subject of it should live at peace together under the roof she left them, but it is certain that as they stood there, they had each, at the same moment, the same unprompted thought. Each became aware, on the spot, that the dear old house itself was exactly what she, and exactly what the other, wanted. It met in perfection their longing for a quiet harbour and an assured future. Each, in short, was willing to take the other in order to get the house. It was therefore not sold, it was made, instead, their own, as it stood, with the dead lady's extremely good old appurtenances, not only undisturbed and undivided, but piously reconstructed and infinitely admired. The ancients of her testamentary purpose rejoicing meanwhile to see the business so simplified. They might have had their private doubts, or their wives might have, some might cynically predicted the sharpest of quarrels, before 3 months were out, between the deluded yoke-fellows and the dissolution of their partnership, with every circumstance of recrimination. All that needed to be said is such prophets would have prophesied vulgarly. The Mrs. Thrush were not vulgar, and they had dropped deep the cup of singleness and found it prevailingly bitter. They were not unacquainted with solitude and sadness, and they recognized with due humility the supreme opportunity of their lives. By the end of 3 months, moreover, each knew the worst about the other. Miss Amy took her evening nap before dinner, and how at which Miss Susan could never sleep. It was so odd, where Miss Susan took hers just after that meal, just at the hour when Miss Amy was keenest for talk. Miss Susan, erect and unsupported, had feelings, I should say, in which almost any posture could pass for a seated one. Miss Amy managed to find a place in the small of her back for 2 out of the 3 sofa cushions, a smaller place, obviously, that they had ever been intended to fit. But when all this was said, they continued to have on either side the pleasant consciousness of a personal soil, not devoid of fragmentary ruins to dig in. They each had a theory that their lives had been immensely different, and each appeared now to the other that conducted their career so perversely, only that she should have an unfamiliar range of anecdote for her companion's ear. Miss Susan, at foreign pensions, had met the Russian, the Polish, the Danish, and even an occasional flower of the English nobility, as well as many of the most extraordinary Americans, who, as she said, had made everything of her, and with whom she had remained, often in correspondence, while Miss Amy, after all less conventional, at the end of her long years in London, abounded in reminiscences of literary, artistic, and even Miss Susan heard it with bated breath, theatrical society, under the influence of which she had been written. There, it came out, a novel that had been anonymously published in a play that had been strikingly type-copied. Not the least charm, clearly, of this picturesque outlook on Mara would be the support that might be drawn from getting work back, as she hinted, with general society bravely sacrificed, to real work. She had it in her head hundreds of plots, with which the future, accordingly, seemed to bristle for Miss Susan. The latter, on her side, was only waiting for the wind to go down to take up again her sketching. The wind at Mar was often high, as was natural in a little old huddled, red-roofed, historic south coast town in which had once been a manor mistress, as the cousins reminded each other of the Channel, and from which, high and dry on its hilltop though it might be, the sea had not so far receded as not to give constantly a taste of temper. Miss Susan came back to English scenery with a small sigh of fondness to which the consciousness of the Alps and Apennines only gave more of a quaver. She had picked out her subjects, and with her head on one side and a sense that they were easier abroad, sat sucking her water brush and nervously, perhaps even a little inconsistently, waiting and hesitating. What had happened that they had, each for herself, rediscovered the country. Only Miss Amy, emerging from Bloomsbury lodging, spoke of it as primroses and sunsets, as Miss Susan, rebounding from the Arno and the Roost, called it with a shy sympathetic pride, simply England. The country was at any rate in the house with them as well as in the little green girdle and the little big blue belt. It was in the objects and relics that they handled together and wondered over, finding in them a ground for much inferred importance and invoked romance, stuffing large toys into very small openings and pulling every faded bell rope that might jingle rustily into the pass. They were still here in the presence, at all events, of their common ancestors, as to whom, more than ever before, they took only the best for granted. Was not the best, for that matter, the best, that is, of little melancholy, middling, disinherited Mar, seated in every stiff chair of the decent old house and stitched into the patchwork of every quaint old counterpane?